And signed the first meaningful gun safety law in 30 years. Now we're not stopping there. I'm coming back. We are going to ban assault weapons again. I did it once and I'm going to do it again.
What happens when self-defense is against the law? What happens when the protectors become the predators? What happens when innocents are betrayed? Imagine that 2/3 of all Americans disappear. 170 million people. Or that the countries of Germany, France, and Spain are virtually wiped off the map. 170 million people gone. In the 20th century, that's how many innocents were slaughtered, tortured, starved, mutilated, worked to death, bayoneted, hanged, annihilated at the hands of their governments. They had no means to defend themselves. World War I is underway. A new government has taken power over Turkey's crumbling Ottoman Empire. The rulers say they want to rid the country of wrong and lawless ideas. They want to protect national security. They decide to eliminate the Armenians from Turkey. Eliminate the Armenians by killing the Armenians. In February 1915, Turkey's political leaders and Muslim religious leaders make a detailed secret plan to annihilate the largely Christian minority. To reduce opposition, they lie about their intentions. The rulers proceed step by step. The first move: draft as many Armenian men as possible into the Turkish army. Thousands report for duty. The Armenian soldiers are then separated from their units and sent to labor camps, where they are worked to death, starved, or murdered in groups far out of public view. Not all of the men are gone, however. The next step: confiscate all weapons from Armenian civilians. Finding many guns is not hard. Turkey already has a gun control law requiring gun owners to report themselves to the government. Then comes the order: all Armenians must turn in their guns or face severe penalties. Policemen and soldiers go from house to house, ransacking homes and torturing people to get their guns. Armenians become so afraid of torture that they buy guns from other Turks, just so they can have something for the soldiers and policemen to take away. On June 26, 1915, the final stage of the genocide begins. The government proclamation declares, all Armenians will be deported to remote camps. No exceptions. Armenians have 5 days to get ready. They may bring only what they can carry. Armed guards gather the Armenians, mostly women, children, the old, and the sick, into groups of between 200 and 4,000 people to form convoys. The guards force-march the Armenians over rough terrain and into the deserts during the hot summer months. People drop from exhaustion, are killed by the guards, or simply left to die. Sometimes the guards shoot or cut to pieces all the Armenians in a convoy. Fewer than 1 in 10 survive the march, and most of the survivors are butchered in the end. The death toll is staggering, as planned. 1.5 million Armenians, men, women, and children, have been eliminated from the earth. 3/4 of the Armenian population of Turkey. In the early 1930s, the outside world believes the Soviet Union is a paradise for workers and peasants. But for millions, that paradise is hell. In those years, the people of Ukraine, the Volga Basin, and the Caucasus are being deliberately starved to death by their own government. The groundwork for that cold-blooded famine was laid when the communists came to power in 1917. Almost immediately, they passed a series of laws, making it nearly impossible for non-party members to own firearms. They used licensing laws to tell them exactly who had guns, and with that information, they confiscated firearms. Penalties for possession of weapons grew more and more harsh. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, fears enemies everywhere, but especially in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine's prosperous farmers crave independence. Stalin craves their grain to pay for industrial expansion. In 1929, Stalin decrees that all farmland, livestock, and produce in the Soviet Union belong to the state. Farmers are ordered to surrender their land and livestock and move to government-owned collective farms. But first, to terrify the rest into submission, several million of the most prosperous farmers are sent to forced labor or killed outright. These kulaks, as the best farmers are called, are demonized and excluded from society. Armed government thugs steal their property, sneering, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for it all belongs to us." Next, Stalin demands extraordinary quotas of grain, quotas no one could possibly meet, quotas enforced by soldiers with guns. Many farmers rebel. Resistance is fierce. But because of 10 years of firearms confiscations, the helpless people can fight back only with farm tools or sabotage. The worst is still to come. In 1932, Stalin takes the ultimate revenge on those who dared oppose him. Because Stalin controls all food distribution, he can cut off food supplies and starve entire regions. Because he controls all travel with internal passports, his secret police can force starving millions to remain within the devastated lands. Grain elevators stand full, but grain rots on the ground as Stalin refuses to distribute food. The powerless people can do nothing to stop their master. Catastrophe strikes and lasts for 2 endless years. Spies watch for anyone trying to take grain from the fields. Anyone caught hiding food is executed. Desperate families resort to cannibalism. Meanwhile, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning Moscow correspondent Walter Duranty assures the world that there is no famine. And Stalin dupes the world by actually increasing the amount of grain exported from the Soviet Union. The United States and the League of Nations embrace and recognize the prosperous Soviet Union. From Moscow, Times reporter Duranty secretly confides the truth to Western governments, that as many as 10 million defenseless lives have been wiped out, with politically engineered starvation as the murder weapon. Chinese culture is built on obligation and obedience. The individual serves family, society, and state. Law governs the masses, but rulers stand above the law. The people easily become pawns. 20th century China is filled with turmoil and war. In the early years, nationalists vie with communists for political control. By 1935, the nationalist government, now in full power, prohibits private ownership of arms. A person can be punished even if he violates the law unintentionally. But the new laws do not bring peace to the disarmed and obedient citizens of China. 1942 to 44. 4 million die in famines aggravated by government confiscation of crops. 1937 to 1949. The Sino-Japanese War. Men who refuse to be drafted into the army are tortured, mutilated, and killed. Many uncooperative soldiers are shot or starved to death. The toll, another 4 million. And in 1937, there is Nanking. 225,000 Japanese troops advance on the city. 300,000 Chinese soldiers flee, throwing down their weapons in the path of the oncoming Japanese war machine. Hundreds of thousands of children, women, sick, and old people are left to the mercy of a merciless foreign invader. Lacking any tradition of self-defense and forbidden to own firearms, the people of Nanking are cornered and helpless. They are raped, buried alive, burned alive, used for bayonet practice, and forced to watch as their own organs are cut out of them. Even a visiting Nazi observer is horrified. More misery is to come. When the communists take over in 1949, they impose their own laws to discourage and punish firearms ownership. The most harmless forms of gun ownership are forbidden. Yet the communists themselves are lawless under Chairman Mao's drive to produce an ideal society. From the agrarian reforms of the 1950s to the Cultural Revolution near the end of Mao's reign, men, women, and children are treated as tools of the government or as enemies of the state. During 38 long years, communist violence and economic experiments wipe out an additional 35 million Chinese, and possibly as many as 100 million. Chairman Mao said that guns were the ultimate source of all political power. He controlled all the guns. The Kingdom of Cambodia has existed for centuries, but after 90 years under French domination, the country is in chaos. In 1975, following 5 years of civil war, the Communist Khmer Rouge seized power. Led by dictator Pol Pot, they set about purifying the country. Communist regimes elsewhere in the world had aimed to establish paradise on earth someday. The Khmer Rouge want it now. Their idea of paradise means eliminating all religious leaders, monks, nuns, priests and preachers, political enemies, city dwellers, Vietnamese and members of other undesirable ethnic groups, all traces of Western culture or capitalism, all students and intellectuals, professionals, anyone who can speak English or French or who has more than a 7th grade education. Merely wearing eyeglasses marks people for death squads. The Khmer Rouge don't need any new laws. Their will is the law. But ever since a series of earlier uprisings, Cambodia has had tight restrictions on firearms ownership, such as laws restricting the number of weapons. And permits so strict that a firearm owner can't even loan a gun to a family member. Combined with Cambodia's poverty and non-violent Buddhist traditions, these laws ensure that very few Cambodians own firearms or are prepared for any form of self-defense. Anyone who fought against the Khmer Rouge and any civilians who owned firearms are forced to disarm the moment Pol Pot takes power. The defenseless people are unaware and unready for what is to come. The Khmer Rouge force mass evacuations of the cities. Believing the evacuations will be temporary, Cambodians neither resist nor take enough food to survive. The move is not temporary. The entire population of the country, those who are not slaughtered outright, is herded onto collective farms to labor without homes, personal possessions, or families. All of Cambodia is turned into a concentration camp, brutally administered. No one can receive mail or phone calls, books, or skilled medical care. All human relationships are shattered. The simple act of saying a kind word to a child is punishable by death. The methodical evacuation and slaughter fit well with Pol Pot's goal: to reduce Cambodia's population from 7 million to about 1 million primitive agricultural workers. Year by year, for the next 4 years, the Khmer Rouge murder Cambodians at a rate 8 times higher than that of Nazi Germany. More than a quarter of the country's population dies before Vietnamese troops invade with machine guns, helicopter gunships, and tanks. It takes them only a month to put a stop to the madness. In Uganda, 300,000 undefended people die, yet few outsiders care. The world turns its eyes away. It is the hidden genocide. When Idi Amin comes to power in 1971, the world's political leaders embrace him. Amin overthrows dictator Milton Obote, who had banned political parties, killed opponents, and enacted a socialist agenda. Obote's government had also passed laws forbidding private citizens to possess firearms. Only government officials and other friends could get permission. Obote had been unpopular, and who could be worse? Surely not big, strapping Idi Amin, a clown who sometimes jumps into swimming pools in his full-dress general's uniform. But Amin is not merely worse. He is unspeakable. He immediately orders the slaughter of all soldiers whose loyalty he doubts. 16,000 men disappear in the next few months. Next, Amin claims that God has instructed him to throw every Asian out of the country. Then all the English people must go. Amin confiscates their businesses and land to give to his cronies. Uganda plunges into chaos. To prevent resistance, Amin makes it illegal for 3 or more people to be together if one of them is armed. Firearms are seized at Amin's whim. Amin's personal agents run amok. They torture and cruelly mutilate their targets, mostly Christians, rival tribespeople, and anyone Amin or his soldiers just happen to dislike. The dead include a university vice-chancellor, an Anglican bishop, a Supreme Court justice who dares rule against Amin's whims, and the Minister of the Interior, who is dismembered alive. Death squads sometimes make victims lie down in gutters to make their blood easier to wash away. Most Ugandans have no arms and no power to resist the killer regime. The orgy of slaughter continues for 8 years. In 1979, Amin is finally overthrown. Saudi Arabia welcomes him as a guest, and there he lives for decades in peace. The smiling monster never faces prosecution for the death of 300,000 innocents. 90% of Rwanda's population belongs to the Hutu tribe. About 9% are Tutsi. The tribes often intermarry, but rivalries have simmered, especially since Belgian colonial rulers in the early 20th century gave political authority to the Tutsi minority. By 1994, a Hutu regime has been in power for many years. Some Tutsis have threatened rebellion, and the government has responded by calling all Tutsis rebels. The government has fueled a campaign of hate, preaching violence against Tutsis. State-controlled radio stations call for the extermination of the Tutsi. And in April, it begins. The grave is only half full, one radio station declares. Who will help us to fill it? Thousands of murderers help in an unspeakable frenzy that lasts 100 days. Government troops participate. So do armed Hutu gangs that have been issued weapons for the purpose. Weapons are sometimes crude. Machetes, axes, nail-studded clubs, and blunt instruments. Some attackers use firearms. But the helpless Tutsi and those Hutu who oppose the government often have nothing more than rocks. Laws and poverty have kept the victims from getting weapons to defend themselves. The Minister of Defense controls permits for weapons and keeps a registry of those few people allowed to possess firearms. The Minister of Defense is also the chief organizer of the nationwide killing campaign. If victims can find or make weapons equal to those of their attackers, then they stand a chance of surviving. In Kigali province, civilians huddle in a church compound, using rocks, bows and arrows, and a single gun seized from a dead soldier. They hold off attackers for a week. Eventually, they are overwhelmed by troops wielding grenades. 5,500 die. In one town, the mayor urges villagers to disarm, saying the police will protect them. When they refuse, he orders police to shoot them. The war of rocks against bullets in that town lasts 3 days. In the end, 20,000 townspeople are massacred. Across Rwanda, tens of thousands hide in schools and churches. They are besieged and beaten or shot to death. To catch people trying to escape the killing, roadblocks are set up throughout the country. Soldiers check national ID cards. Unarmed, defenseless people whose cards identify them as Tutsi are slaughtered, man, woman, and child. Merely to be who you are is punishable by death.